Hello and welcome to Recap Radio. I'm Diego Cupolo, editor-in-chief of Turkey Recap, and this is our live show about Turkish politics and foreign policy. Today I'm talking to Can Selçuki, an economist and director of Research Istanbul, which conducts studies on economic, political, and societal issues in Turkey. Can also runs the Susam Bulletin, which is a Turkish language data newsletter. Thank you for joining us, Can.
Thank you for having me, Diego. Good to be here.
And full disclosure, Can and I used to be neighbors in Istanbul, and my daughter has attended your son's birthday party.
That's right.
And
that was 2 years ago now.
Yes, I hope your son's doing well, your family's doing well.
Yeah, thank you.
And also, you once ran an ad on Turkey Recap with your other platform, Türkiye Raporu, which was a long time ago as well.
Yes.
But Türkiye Raporu continues or not?
Türkiye Raporu continues. We do a 2,000 people survey across Turkey. We've been doing it for the past 6 years, in fact. And we share the results in English and in Turkish with our institutional subscribers.
Great. So,
if anybody's interested, drop me a line.
So, in this webcast, we're going to talk about the state of Turkey's economy, where it stands in the global context, and what to expect next. We're going to try to talk about 40 minutes. We welcome questions from the live audience, and let's get right into it. To set some statistical foundations, the World Bank puts Turkey's economy at the 17th largest in the world, with a GDP of 1.32 trillion in 2024. In 2025, Turkey's GDP growth is forecasted between 3 and 4%. Many are saying 3.5. That's among the highest in the world for all countries, right? And annual inflation is slowly falling in recent months, but less so, let's say, over the summer. It's kind of staying in this low 30s range. Right now, it was 33% in October, according to the latest official statistics from the state. And at the same time, this contrasts with public opinion in Turkey. Many people are living years of high inflation, and there's diminishing purchasing power that's made life very expensive, like rent and rice and beans, which I've talked about before. Kuru fasulye is too expensive. So can you give a overview of what's driving high growth and high inflation in Turkey in the current moment?
Sure. I mean, look, when we talk about the drivers of growth in Turkey for the past 20 years, for a better majority of the past 2 decades, it's been, there have been two main drivers of growth: cheap FX, cheap foreign money, and a very strong domestic demand. But obviously, the global liquidity conditions have started to change since 2014. Whereby the expansion of after the 2008 global financial crisis, in 2014, the central banks, most notably Fed, European and Japan, started the tapering and shrinking their balance sheets, and cheap money, cheap FX started to, was no longer available. So in 2018, Turkey sort of started to attempt to change its drivers of growth, and that's where we, fall into the discussion of low interest rates, depreciated lira, in order to build up domestic manufacturing capacity and make exports more competitive. But the problem was, for a long while, this was only tried through the monetary policy, and that obviously doesn't work, right? And in the lead up to the 2023 elections, also the earthquake in February 2023, and all the macroeconomic choices that have been done so far sort of threw the Turkish macro off balance. And since May 2023 elections, economic management has been trying to restore order in the macroeconomic balance, with some little success, I have to say, because usually such programs don't tend to take so long. I mean, if you go back to the 2001 crisis, it took around 6-7 months for the economy to get back on speed, which the government at the time couldn't really use, because then the coalition partner MHP called for an unexpected snap elections. But that's history now. But as I said, I mean, it's been almost 2.5 years since Mr. Şimşek and his team have come to power at the helm, keeping managing the economic policy, and now it's been taking so long. But again, for the past 5 years, the main economic driver of Turkish economy has been mostly domestic demand. Now, so obviously there's a mismatch between the headline growth levels and household financial situation, right? And whereas, like whereas you said, Turkish growth is doing very well in comparison, in comparison to similar countries or globally. In fact, you don't see the kind of improvement in everyday life of wage earners and households in general. There are a number of reasons for that. One, obviously, now that everybody knows, the question at hand, the problem at hand is being tackled only through monetary policy. But we have many other, and there's this belief that increase in minimum wages will indeed increase inflation, which is very ironic, Diego, because the central bank itself has papers that prove otherwise, right? Increase in minimum wages only contribute very little to an increase in inflation, whereas increase in the general wealth of higher income, higher wealth households have a tendency to increase inflation much more, because whereas lower income households mostly consume durables, like the non-durables, stuff that we need, like food, electricity, rent, and things like that. When these households make more, they don't tend to overspend on the non-durables because they consume as much as they need. Whereas when higher income households gain more, they tend to overspend on non-durables, which is more likely to contribute to inflation in a negative way. So there's this ideological and philosophical difference in how the current economic management approaches in bringing down inflation. So in short, the headline, rather high comparative terms and real terms high growth rate, doesn't really translate into a better distribution of income and provide relief for low income households.
Yeah. And can you comment briefly on real estate? Because it seems to be the safer bet that many are taking, apart from investing heavily in gold, which is not so safe depending on where you store it, right? But there's been a huge swing towards real estate investments in Turkey that's really driving up prices to levels I've never experienced in my 10 years here. It's become very expensive to rent.
Mhm. Well, there are a few reasons for that. One is obviously the safety of of real estate, right? And Turkish people, much like elsewhere in the world, but most notably in Turkey, there are two things they like very much to invest in. One is gold, and the second one is real estate. The increase in rents, actually, the first wave of increase was due to the rent increase cap that was applied prior to the May 2023 elections. So all the increases that weren't made legally before the 2023 elections were loaded afterwards, and that caused the interest rates the rents to increase much more than the inflation, and definitely more than the interest rate. So that's one reason. The second reason is obviously a supply and demand issue, whereas there is quite a bit of a supply. This supply satisfies more second, third homeowners, not the ones that actually need it. And that's why the government recently announced actually a low income household a housing project. And I think there has been a huge number of applications in the tune of millions, although the criteria for application has been kept rather strict. So that's another issue with the rents. But all in all, the rent issue, housing is a huge problem for especially low income households, because it's taking up too much of the disposable income of the household.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how's Turkey compare to other middle income countries at the moment? Because Turkey does have some structural and geographic advantages, right? It's near Europe. There's a proximity to markets there. You have this friend-shoring, near-shoring debate after COVID that we should have our supply lines close to the markets. At the same time, Turkey benefits from different European trade agreements. It's part of NATO. It has the ability, the defense industry, for example, makes weapons that fit into the NATO structure. What it's called interoperability, right? That the weapons can match well with other NATO countries' weapons. At the same time, Turkey has limited energy resources and is very reliant on gas and oil imports from Russia and Azerbaijan. So, how do you compare Turkey to other nations in its category?
Well, speaking from a purely growth perspective, it's doing well, obviously, right? But I think the geopolitical advantages of Turkey, I think we should divide them in two. One is the constant geopolitical dividend potential that Turkey seems to enjoy, and which I call a Bayram economy, right? What I mean by geopolitical dividends is, what's happening in Syria, the potential opening up of Armenian Turkey border for trade, and potential ending of Ukraine Russia war up north. So all of these produce a geopolitical dividend in favor of Turkey. But the problem is, and throughout history, I find Turkey has been operating in a Bayram economy when it comes to its geopolitical dividends. And I'll tell you what a Bayram economy is. Observers of Turkey or people living in Turkey will know that we have two Bayrams, religious Bayrams every year. And as small kids, we would kiss the hands of our elderly and they would give us money. But as kids, we would never say, Diego, you know what, let me save some of this Bayram money because harder times may come and we will spend it there. What we would do instead, we would go and spend it on the candy store immediately because we would always know that 3 months later, another Bayram would come. So geopolitical dividends are like that for Turkey, right? A Bayram always comes. So we always sort of spend the money not for long-term structural investments, but rather we squander the money for election cycles and a more populist policy. So Turkey benefits from this, but on a short term. In the longer term, looking at it from a more macro level, yes, Turkey is obviously in a customs union with the EU, which helped Turkey increase its productivity, particularly in the manufacturing sector since 1995. But at the same time, Turkey has been suffering from a total factor productivity growth, and Turkey needs new areas of productivity growth to boost its development and carry its development to the next round. Now, at this point, the discussion of friend-shoring or near-shoring comes into place. But these are all issues that Turkey can benefit if it makes the right strategy, right planning. And right now, I don't see that happening. And these things usually take a long time. And much more immediate until friend-shoring happens. And for the listeners, let's perhaps define what friend-shoring is. It is like you said, after COVID, the global supply chain realized that we shouldn't be so far thin spread. We should sort of bring in manufacturing and supply chains together to mitigate the risks of a global crisis. But also in this new geopolitical restructuring of the world, countries are trying to mitigate their risks when they are trading with potential adversaries, say China or Russia. But these sort of repositioning of supply chains and investment takes time. But while this is happening or not, because we don't really have signs that it's really happening, we have a much more, Turkey in particular, is a much more real and imminent risk, which is the Chinese competition. China is characterized by immense overcapacity due to, again, immense investments in the past years. And when China can't sell to the US, it naturally looks around and moves into areas that it didn't used to be present before. And that very well coincides with areas where Turkey has a competitive advantage. So I think the real issue in this geopolitical context for Turkey is the competition that's coming from China to this part of the world. And there's actually a great policy area where Turkey and EU can cooperate actually to mitigate this risk, both for EU and China, but at the same time increase investment and increase trade of both parties. But I find that both at the EU level and the Turkish level, these, nobody's really talking about. Everybody's talking about this, but nobody's really talking about this, right? Which sort of characterizes EU-Turkey relations for the past, I don't know, 10 years maybe. And this is one of those areas. We recently wrote a paper from Research Istanbul that looked at,
Yeah,
for example.
I was going to ask you just to
Yeah.
let it out. Instead of
Yeah,
working
you need
with
to interrupt me,
blocks,
by the way. I talk too much.
that's fine. Instead of working with the EU as a bloc, Turkey seems to be strengthening its bilateral relations with independent nations like Spain, Italy. You see different defense contracts and trade agreements. And your paper for the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies, EDAM, published last week, I believe, is talking about UK and Turkey trade agreement negotiations. There is a free trade agreement between those countries, but they want to upgrade it basically. And you make the case for different points that maybe you want to highlight now that I've interrupted you.
Sure. Look, I think your point is great. I mean, look at a few things. I mean, deepening, visa liberalization isn't going anywhere. Deepening and modernizing the customs union isn't going anywhere. Turkey has been excluded from SAFE. So, add all these together. I can understand the lack of appetite on the Turkey side as well to deal with the EU as a bloc rather than working with individual member states, which there is, in fact, appetite. So, defense deals in Italy or talking with the UK about a new FTA is actually part of this narrative. So the deal, FTA agreement negotiations with the UK is particularly important because it's the first time that Turkey is going into negotiation with a non-EU but large and significant European country on a deal of this magnitude. And the most significant part of this deal is that it covers services, professional services, which is not covered by the customs union. So the customs union covers manufactured goods and processed food products, whereas the UK-Turkey trade deal looks at professional services. So that sort of provides a sort of a framework for Turkey to deal with this big non-EU European country and sort of forge a deal also outside of the EU that will definitely bring the two countries together. And speaking to both sides, I often see that they are very ambitious about the timeline of such a deal, whereas these things should take around 7-8 years. They go, both sides are talking about ending this in 2 or 3 years. So this is, I think, a new paradigm. Not a paradigm, but a new modus operandi for how Turkey may deal with different European countries. And I think, if anything, this should put more pressure on both the EU and Turkey in order to modernize and deepen the customs union.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest developments recently is rare earth minerals and the need for more of them. And Turkey supposedly has a good amount. We're waiting for confirmation from what I understand in the news.
Yeah.
The Ministry of Energy says there's a large amount in Eskişehir province, but we're waiting for confirmation. At the same time, we have Chinese investment, EV developments, right? There's a supposed different factories that are going to manufacture either automobiles or parts of automobiles in Turkey to sell to EU markets is the main project there. But looking at this architecture of resources and cheap labor, coming from a Latin American background, this is resources and, can you make a higher value product for export that creates a middle class and higher class, right? Or does this become a middle income trap for Turkey where you become used for your resources and then cheap labor? What do you think about Turkey's, ability to get out of this kind of let's say stagnation. I think that might be too big a word, but it doesn't seem to be rising like it used to from the 90s. There was a big income per capita income increase, but we haven't seen that in the last decade or so. How does Turkey's economy advance to continue growing people's individual income and quality of life?
So let me just intervene there for a second and say that Turkey is no longer a cheap labor location. Whereas Turkish laborers might be suffering under the cost of living crisis, comparatively, Turkey is no longer a cheap labor destination. Let me say that. Where is the new cheap labor destination? Definitely looking at it, Egypt, right? And I'll give you an example. A blue collar textile worker roughly costs a Turkish business 1,000 euros a month. The same costs around $120 in Egypt. So there's no comparison here, right?
Mhm.
So those days of Turkey benefiting from, exporting intermediary goods, importing cheap intermediary goods in dollars from Asia and exporting to more expensive EU countries and cheap labor, add to this cheap labor, this kind of competitive advantage is no longer for Turkey. So Turkey has to move into a higher value creation economy. And there are some opportunities to do that as well, right? Most notably, although, given the current situation, to talk about the Green Deal seems a bit of a luxury. And, whenever I go around Anatolia, I give this example, the kitchen is on fire and we're talking about renovating the living room, right? When you talk about the Green Deal, but it's real and it's coming our way. I mean, it's regardless of what Trump administration seems to think currently, it's coming our way, and it's a great chance for Turkey to actually upgrade its manufacturing base and make it more compatible with the EU, and make it more competitive as well in other parts of the world, as these norms will inevitably spread around the world. Now, so short question to your answer is, in order to improve wages in Turkey, first of all, the ideological background of allocation of resources need to change, because this idea that minimum wages and lower income household spending causes inflation should be deserted, definitely. But then Turkey needs to upgrade its manufacturing. And also, one discussion I find that too much in Turkey is that everybody's too stuck on manufacturing, right? Manufacturing, as we know it, will not come back to this part of the world. And I think the U.S. administrations having the same nostalgia over bringing back manufacturing to U.S., most notably the Rust Belt. But that's not going to happen because of technology, because the labor force has changed. So yes, some high-end manufacturing will remain and will be very important. But another rising sector in the world is services and services trade. And indeed, global services trade has surpassed goods trade in the past couple of years. So Turkey also needs to be looking at better educating its workforce to accommodate for higher-end professional services jobs. So in short, Turkey needs to upgrade its manufacturing base more in line with the green transformation, but also upgrade its human capital to better accommodate high-end professional services. And when I was living in Brussels back in 2010, every politician that came to Brussels would start the sentences like this: Turkey has a young, vibrant population, right? That is no longer. I mean, that is still the case, but the demographic window is quickly collapsing, right? Birth rates are down. Dependency ratios have shrunk greatly. So Turkey is also facing a labor issue as well. So all these structural problems need to be addressed for Turkey to avoid this so-called middle income trap. Now, when you look at actually official numbers, Turkey has indeed graduated into high income countries, but you are living in Ankara, I'm living in Istanbul. I travel the country all the time. By no means what I'm seeing on the ground resembles a high income country. But in order to avoid this, get out of this slump, Turkey needs to make these structural changes and stop relying on monetary policy for every single problem it has.
Yeah. And I always welcome corrections. The there's a big informal labor market, right?
Sure.
And a lot of it is women in agriculture specifically, right? There's many people being paid.
I think it's
very
across the board, by the way. I mean, it's across the board.
Yeah. So when you say adjustments need to be made in education, it seems like there's been a lot of meddling in education and different. Just from me following it in my time here, I've seen the education system change multiple times.
Mhm.
What can you say about the, let's say, volatility of educational programs and how that impacts the economic output later on? Because it does seem like the curriculum changes faster than the students can complete the, school sessions.
Right. Look, on the pre-university higher education level, you're absolutely right. But the real issue here is that Turkey, I think, has around 300 universities right now. And I would say probably 70% of them would not qualify as a university by any global standards, right?
Mm.
So we've invested in these universities, and Turkey has among the highest university graduate unemployment in Europe, which by statistics is true, but actually it's not true because a lot of those people are not actually university graduates. Yes, they hold a diploma, but the skills they have are not university level skills. So they don't want to go work. They don't have the skills to go work in blue collar jobs, obviously, and they don't want to because they are university graduates. So that's the main issue. The higher education system in Turkey is very problematic, and this has to be overturned to bring up a generation that has more technical skills than these useless university diplomas that account for nothing, right? That are good for nothing. So that's the real core of the issue. And why so many universities were established? Two reasons from what I can see. One, they are good for local development, right? When you open up a university, you have students coming in, they buy stuff, they rent houses and whatnot. But obviously, opening up universities is not a stellar example of regional development. But on the other hand, it's a populist move as well, right? I mean, people, we've opened up 300 universities, right? It sounds good, but amounts to not much at the end of the day. So I think Turkey needs to rethink its entire higher education system and strike a better balance between technical skills, which in fact, even today, probably are making letting people make more or closer to higher education graduates. So Turkey needs to restrike that balance and calibrate its workforce.
Yeah. And then, we have to talk a little bit about politics.
Sure.
Turkey is in an unstable region. There's been conflicts, there's been trade restrictions, there's tariffs, from Trump. There's also sanctions that impact Turkey in ways that don't impact other countries, right? It's neighbor to Russia and Iran. And those tariffs or sanctions are particularly damaging to Turkey's trade abilities with its neighbors. At the same time, internally, we have a lot of politicized investigations against the opposition, but increasingly, we're seeing companies being investigating. The biggest one in the news lately has been John Holding. Amid all of this, we have the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, coming to Turkey to assess Turkey's, let's say, credentials or ability to prevent money laundering and the funding of terrorist activities. Turkey was on a gray list several years back. I think it got taken off last year, right? So can you explain what that gray list is and what you believe Turkish authorities are trying to do in this moment to basically keep the markets open and pass this Financial Action Task Force review?
Now, the gray list is a list that I'm looking at my notes. I don't want to say something wrong, but gray list is basically when the FATF believes that the countries are not complying with their guidelines. So I think some of the business crackdown recently, while it has its political offshoots, definitely has to do with complying with the FATF. But there are two issues here, Diego. The reason Turkey was removed from the gray list was because Turkey indeed complied with the administrative side of the requirements, right? And I think Turkey did a good job there. But there are some other issues that I think it's much more difficult to reconcile. Is that, for example, Turkey doesn't recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization, right? And that's a fundamental difference. And there's no way to overcome this, by the way, right? So, on the other hand, being on the FATF gray list, why? Yes, it hurts credibility. It's not a very marginalized. It's not a very marginal occurrence. I mean, US was recently on the gray list as well, right? So, I mean, it's a big deal and it's not a big deal, right? A country like Turkey in need of foreign currency, access to foreign capital markets, obviously wouldn't want to introduce new risk premiums to its financing. But at the same time, there are some fundamental differences in the way that Turkey looks at these things that cannot be reconciled. The administrative side Turkey can do and has done and has come out. So there are these differences, and I'm not at the. I don't know how to comment on how the FATF takes this, because obviously this is not only about the FATF. This is a part of a much broader geopolitical discussion. Huh?
But you are linking recent investigations to this visit.
Look, I think some of the investigations have definitely to do with compliance, sure. But, oftentimes, like elsewhere in the world, but also in Turkey, Diego, none of these are, binary events, right? Whereas some of this has to be, may have to do with compliance with FATF. Some also it has, a political bickering and within domestic fighting, political infighting as well. So I think these domestic things are serve to both ends.
Mm-hmm. And to end with some forward-looking speculation, which is our favorite, Turkey since 2002, between 2002 and 2022, that 20-year period, it had an average real GDP growth of 5.4%. That doubled people's per capita income in real terms. That does a significant boost to people's quality of life.
Of course.
Where do you see where do you see Turkey's economy going in the next year or two, and maybe possibly, I don't know how far you want to go, 2030? Do you see Turkey bouncing back, becoming competitive? What do you think about future forecasting?
It depends. It depends on the policy choice, right? I think Turkey is at a point where if it makes the right choices, it can get out of the slump and move into a more development-oriented growth trajectory, more inclusionary, most definitely. But so far, the planning doesn't seem to be in this direction. The coordination between businesses and the public sector doesn't seem to be in this direction. So my answer is obviously, any consultant's favorite answer. It depends, right? But let me tell you this. I mean, Turkey has elections coming up in 2 years. So for the next 2 years, what we will probably see is that at some point, this tightening will leave for more fiscal expansion. We've already heard rumors last week that in a closed meeting, Mr. Şimşek hinted about minimum wage support program for 2026, which seems timely if we consider. For me, I think the elections will be held in November 2027, so the timing actually seems right. But I think in the immediate future, Turkey will go into a election economy cycle again. What will happen after that, I think, would be too speculative.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that we're going to continue to see inflation rates at this level? Do you expect it to go down? And do you believe the inflation rates? Let's go with that.
I have more belief, let me say, in the inflation rates. And I'll give you a very simple reason. And this will be a bit of an advertisement. Every month we do something called the Lahmacun Index. I don't know if you saw it. So every month we gather lahmacun prices from 30 largest cities of Turkey, from more than 3,000 different restaurants, and we sort of track the changes. So the change in monthly average lahmacun price seems to be somewhat in line with what TÜİK is announcing. For the past couple of months, we found it to be lower than TÜİK, but generally it's a little higher than TÜİK. So to me, right now, it seems more or less okay. But the real issue is obviously the inflation rate is still too high, right? I think every average Turkish citizen is now aware that, a 30% inflation doesn't mean that prices are going down. It just means that the increased velocity of prices is decreasing. So the prices continue to raise and wages not so much. So I think that the strain on the household continues to be very real. And if you look at the official unemployment rate, it's around 8%, but the idle workforce is around 30%, and that is likely to increase over fall because we see more and more businesses laying off of people. So why I gave you this rather long explanation, the inflation will come down, sure, but doesn't necessarily mean an improved living conditions for a majority of the population.
Mm-hmm. And to add to your Lahmacun Index, can you do a kuru fasulye index just for me? My favorite food.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, because I'm really suffering with the prices on rice and beans in Turkey, which are my staple food.
With meat or without meat, though?
I mean, they put meat in the sauce, but don't give it to you in the dish, right? So
Okay.
for the flavor, whichever one you got.
All right.
But thank you, Can. To wrap, I'm going to say I'm speaking to Can Selçuki, an economist and director of Research Istanbul, and also the Susam Bulletin newsletter. You can find more of his work at researchistanbul.com and susambulletin.com. Thank you for joining us, Can.
And let me just say this: the reason it's called Susam Bulletin, Diego, which will be very apparent to you, is because our offices are on Susam Street.
Yes, that's what we're looking at here, right? Is that Susam?
Yeah, that's Cihangir Street, actually. Susam is the one that looks at the other side, but very close.
Well, I'm going to put the links to your different outlets in the show notes to this podcast, and people can find that in about an hour or two. I'll post this full recording on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and everywhere else. This podcast is a production of Turkey Recap, a newsletter on Turkish politics, foreign affairs, and business. Visit turkeyrecap.com for more coverage from right here in Ankara. Stay safe, stay well, and hope your family's doing well.
Likewise. Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.